Story number 1. The Whispers of Hoyabachu. I've always been drawn to the unexplainable. As a freelance journalist specializing in the paranormal, I've chased stories of haunted castles, cursed objects, and UFO sightings across Europe. But nothing prepared me for Hoyabachu, the so-called Bermuda Triangle of Transylvania. I first heard about the forest during a trip to Cluj-Napoca, a picturesque Romanian city known more for its Gothic charm than its ghost stories. A local historian, Dr. Mircea Stănescu, introduced me to the legend over a dinner of hearty goulash and red wine. Hoyabachu is no ordinary forest, he said, his voice low and deliberate. It's a gateway. People enter and they don't come back the same. I laughed it off, assuming it was another tourist trap. But Mircea's expression remained grim. Go if you must, he warned. But do not ignore the whispers. They're not your own. 2 days later, I found myself at the edge of Hoyabachu, staring into a wall of twisted trees that seemed to writhe under the gray sky. Their trunks bent and spiraled unnaturally, as if the forest itself was trying to twist free of the earth. A low fog clung to the ground, muffling sound and distorting the light. I was alone, save for my equipment, a camera, a voice recorder, and a notebook. Locals refused to guide me, citing everything from bad omens to outright fear. Even Mircea had declined, shaking his head with a look of pity. You won't find what you're looking for, he'd said, but something will find you. The forest swallowed me whole. The air inside was colder, heavier, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the distant rustle of unseen creatures. As I ventured deeper, the path disappeared, replaced by a labyrinth of gnarled roots and thorny underbrush. It didn't take long for the unease to set in. The silence wasn't natural. It felt deliberate, as if the forest was holding its breath. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, just at the edge of perception. Turn back. I froze, spinning around, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, louder this time, unmistakably human. Turn back. My rational mind told me it was the wind, or perhaps my own imagination. But as I pressed on, the whispers followed, growing in intensity. They came from all directions, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. I reached a clearing known locally as the Circle. It was a perfect, barren patch of earth in the heart of the forest, devoid of trees or vegetation. Nothing grew here, and the air felt wrong, charged with static, as if a storm were brewing just above the treetops. I set up my camera and began snapping photos, but the unease only grew. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I scanned the clearing, my flashlight catching glimpses of the twisted forest beyond. And then I saw her. At first, she was just a shadow, barely visible against the mist. But as I stepped closer, her form became clearer, a woman in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by a curtain of dark hair. She stood perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. Hello, I called, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. Instead, she raised a hand, pointing deeper into the forest. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if her body didn't quite belong to her. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I stepped closer. Are you lost? Do you need help? Her hand dropped, and she turned slowly to face me. Her eyes, or rather, the void where her eyes should have been, locked onto mine. A scream tore through the clearing, loud and piercing, and I stumbled backward, clutching my ears. When I looked up, she was gone. I don't remember running, but I found myself back on the trail, gasping for air. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent, their words blurring together into an unintelligible hum. I fumbled for my recorder, desperate to capture the sound. But when I hit play, the whispers were gone. The forest was silent again. By the time I reached the edge of Hoyabachu, the sun had set, plunging the world into darkness. My relief at seeing the open field was short-lived. My camera was missing, and my notebook, filled with pages of observations, was blank. The only evidence I had of my journey was the faint scent of ozone clinging to my clothes. I returned to Cluj-Napoca, shaken but determined to make sense of what I'd experienced. I played the audio recorder, hoping to find some proof, but all I heard was static. And then, faintly, a single word: stay. Over the following weeks, the dreams began. I saw the woman in white, standing in the clearing, her eyeless gaze boring into me. I heard the whispers, now louder, clearer, repeating the same message: come back. And then the scratches appeared. First, they were small, faint marks on the walls of my apartment, but they grew bolder, forming words: you belong to us. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was stress, paranoia, anything but the truth. But deep down, I knew I'd brought something back with me. The final straw came one night when I woke to find myself standing at the edge of my bed, my hand pressed against the window. Outside, in the street below, stood the woman in white. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her presence filled the room with an unbearable weight. I knew then that I had to return. I don't expect to leave Hoyabachu again. The whispers have grown louder, guiding me deeper into the forest. The woman in white waits for me in the clearing, her hand outstretched, her void-like eyes promising answers I'm not sure I want. If you're reading this, let this be your warning. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some places are not meant to be found. And some whispers are not your own. Story number 2. The Vanishing of Anjikuni. I didn't want to believe the stories. The missing Inuit village, the whispers of supernatural forces, and the inexplicable emptiness of a place that should have been brimming with life. It all sounded like something from a campfire tale. But when you're a journalist chasing the truth, even the most absurd legends are worth a closer look. That's how I found myself standing on the frozen shores of Lake Anjikuni, my breath fogging in the frigid air, staring at the ruins of a village swallowed by time and mystery. It started as a simple assignment. My editor had handed me a file labeled The Vanishing Village, a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings and handwritten notes detailing the strange events of 1930. According to the reports, an entire Inuit village on the shores of Lake Anjikuni had disappeared overnight. Their homes were left intact, meals still steaming on tables, but every person, men, women, and children, was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, and no explanation. Over the decades, theories had ranged from alien abductions to mass hysteria, but no one had ever found the truth. You like the weird stuff? My editor said with a grin. Go dig it up. The journey to Anjikuni was brutal. The lake was miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a battered snowmobile I'd rented from a skeptical local. You don't want to go there, he'd warned, his voice low. Bad things happen to people who get too close. I brushed off his words as superstition, though his uneasy expression lingered in my mind as I rode through the barren, snow-covered wilderness. By the time I reached the village, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the empty huts and frozen ground. The village was exactly as described in the reports, eerily preserved, yet utterly lifeless. The small wooden huts stood in a haphazard circle, their doors creaking in the wind. Inside, I found signs of lives abruptly interrupted, half-knit clothing still on needles, fishing gear neatly stacked, and a stew pot frozen solid on a hearth. But no people, no animals, not even birds. I set up camp in the largest hut, its walls lined with old carvings and faded pelts. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind. I tried to focus on taking notes and snapping photos, but an unease settled over me, growing stronger with each passing hour. And then the whispers began. First, I thought it was the wind, a trick of the air slipping through cracks in the walls. But as I sat by the small fire I'd built, I realized the sound had rhythm, like hushed voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The whispers grew louder, circling me, though there was no one in sight. The snow beneath my boots was pristine, untouched by any tracks but my own. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "Is anyone there?" The whispers stopped. I returned to the hut, bolting the door behind me, but the unease didn't fade. I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation, the weight of the stories playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Around midnight, the temperature plummeted. The fire flickered weakly, the cold seeping into my bones despite the heavy layers I wore. And then I saw it. A figure stood outside the window, barely visible through the frost-covered glass. It was tall and thin, its outline blurred by the swirling snow, but its eyes burned like embers, piercing the darkness with an unnatural light. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence filled the room with a suffocating pressure. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I shone it at the window, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind sent my heart racing, my mind conjuring images of those burning eyes. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to continue my investigation. I couldn't leave. Not yet, not without answers. I spent the day exploring the village, searching for anything that might explain the disappearance. In one hut, I found a journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting in Inuktitut. Couldn't read it, but the final entry was different, scrawled, frantic, as if written in haste. I took a photo of the page, planning to have it translated later, and stepped outside to find the weather had worsened. A storm was rolling in, the wind howling through the village like a living thing. I decided to head back to the main hut, but as I turned, I saw them, figures, dozens of them, standing at the edge of the village. They were indistinct, their forms blending with the snow and shadows. But they were there, watching. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the frozen ground. I shouted, but the wind swallowed my voice. And then, one by one, they began to move. I ran. The wind tore at my face, the cold burning my lungs as I sprinted toward the hut. The figures followed, their movements unnaturally smooth, almost gliding over the snow. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands shaking as I bolted it. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the knocking. It was soft at first, a gentle tap-tap-tap that grew louder, more insistent. The walls creaked under the pressure, and the whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. "Leave," they said. Though the word wasn't spoken, it was inside my head, resonating like a drumbeat. "You don't belong here." The next hours were a blur of terror. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, the walls shaking as the figures pressed against the hut. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. When I opened my eyes, the hut was still, the storm gone. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the walls, illuminating the empty space. The figures were gone, but the air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I didn't stay to investigate further. I packed my gear and left, the silence of the village pressing against my back as I rode away. When I returned to the nearest town, I had the journal translated. The final entry sent chills down my spine. "They are here. They come from the ice. We are leaving, but they will follow. Do not return." To this day, I can't explain what happened at Anjikuni. The rational part of me wants to believe it was isolation, fear, and the power of suggestion. But when I close my eyes, I still see them, those burning eyes in the dark, watching, waiting, and I know the truth. The village didn't vanish. It was taken. Story number 3. The Whispering Pines. When I was 12, the woods were my world. My family lived in the small town of Mill Creek. a rural dot on the map in the heart of the Midwest, surrounded by endless pine forests. It was the kind of place where time felt slow, where the air smelled like damp earth and the wind carried secrets in its rustle through the trees. But Mill Creek had its own shadow, a story that parents told in hushed tones and kids whispered about at sleepovers. The Slender Man, the tall, faceless figure dressed in a black suit who haunted the woods, luring children away with soft whispers that promised dreams but delivered nightmares. No one admitted to believing it outright, but we all knew someone who claimed they'd seen him. I never believed in Slender Man, not until that summer. It began with Adair, my best friend. Tommy had always been braver than me, or maybe just more reckless. He had a talent for finding trouble, and I had a talent for following him into it. That day, he'd come over with a wild grin and a flashlight, his eyes glinting with mischief. "They say Slender Man lives out past the Whispering Pines," he said, as though this was common knowledge. "Let's go find him." The Whispering Pines was what we called a stretch of forest near the old sawmill, where the trees grew unnaturally close together, their branches twisted like arthritic fingers. It was a place we avoided, even in daylight, but Tommy was relentless, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were pushing our bikes down the overgrown trail that led into the woods. The forest was silent, not just quiet, but unnervingly still, as if the world was holding its breath. The deeper we went, the darker it became, the narrow beams of our flashlights cutting through the oppressive blackness. "See? Nothing here," I said, my voice louder than it needed to be. "Let's go back." Tommy ignored me, his flashlight scanning the trees. "What's the matter? Scared?" "No," I lied. We walked in silence for a while, the crunch of our footsteps the only sound. And then we heard it, a faint rustling, just ahead. Tommy froze, his flashlight jerking toward the sound. "What was that?" I whispered. "Probably just an animal," he said, but his voice wavered. The rustling came again, louder this time, accompanied by a low, rhythmic creak, like the groan of a tree swaying in the wind. But there was no wind. The air was heavy, suffocating, and every instinct screamed at me to run. "Let's go," I said, tugging at Tommy's arm, but he shook me off. "Wait, look." His flashlight settled on something up ahead, a tall, thin figure standing perfectly still among the trees. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, a branch caught in the beam of light, but as we stared, it began to move. The figure stepped forward, its impossibly long limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. It was dressed in a black suit, its face a featureless void that seemed to absorb the light. My breath caught in my throat as it turned its blank face toward us, and the air seemed to hum with a low, electric buzz. "Run," Tommy whispered, but I was frozen. The figure raised one long, spindly arm, pointing directly at me. The hum grew louder, filling my ears, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. I felt an overwhelming pull, as though something was reaching into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts and dragging me toward it. "Run," Tommy shouted, shoving me hard. The spell broke, and I stumbled backward, my legs finally obeying. We bolted, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand as we tore through the woods, the trees closing in like a cage. The buzzing followed us, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like my skull was splitting. When we finally burst out of the forest and onto the trail, the noise stopped. The air was still again, but the silence was heavy, oppressive. We didn't stop running until we reached Tommy's house, collapsing on the porch, gasping for air. Neither of us spoke about what we'd seen. Not that night, not the next day, but something had changed. Tommy, usually fearless, grew quiet and withdrawn. He stopped answering my calls, and when I went to his house, his mother said he was sick and couldn't come out. Then, 1 week later, he disappeared. The search lasted for days. The whole town came together, combing the woods with flashlights and dogs, calling his name, They found his bike near the Whispering Pines. But no sign of Tommy, no footprints, no tracks, as if he'd simply vanished. I wanted to tell someone what we'd seen that night, but every time I tried, the words stuck in my throat. Part of me thought no one would believe me. The other part was afraid they would. The dreams started a few days after Tommy disappeared. I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the image of the figure burned into my mind. In the dreams, it stood at the edge of my bed, its faceless head tilting as it reached for me with impossibly long fingers. Sometimes, I'd wake to find my window open, the curtains swaying in a breeze that wasn't there. Once, I found muddy footprints leading from the window to my bed, fading as they reached the floorboards. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped leaving the house. My parents thought it was grief, but it was fear. I knew Tommy wasn't coming back, and I knew Slender Man wasn't finished with me. The last night I saw him was the night I decided to leave Mill Creek for good. I packed a bag and written a note to my parents, explaining that I needed to get away, to start over somewhere far from the woods. It was just past midnight when I heard the knock at the door. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent chills racing down my spine. I stayed frozen in bed, holding my breath as the knock came again, louder this time, and then I heard the voice. "Let me in." It whispered, low and raspy, as if it was coming from inside my own head. The doorknob rattled, and I bolted, grabbing my bag and throwing open the window. I didn't look back as I climbed out and ran into the night, the wind carrying the faint sound of whispers behind me. I never went back to Mill Creek. I moved to the city, changed my name, tried to forget. But some nights, when the air is heavy and the wind rustles the trees just right, I hear it. Let me in. And I know it's only a matter of time before Slender Man finds me again. Story number 4. The Dolls of Nagoro. When I first heard about Nagoro, I thought it was just another quirky footnote in Japan's endless list of unique destinations. A village of dolls? Hundreds of life-sized figures scattered across an abandoned town? It sounded like something out of a Tim Burton film. Eerie but ultimately harmless. I was wrong. My fascination with forgotten places had brought me to Japan. Camera in hand and an itinerary full of ghost towns and overgrown shrines. Nagoro was supposed to be the highlight of my trip. I'd read articles about Tsukimi Ayano, the elderly woman who had turned her empty hometown into a macabre art installation. She'd crafted dolls to replace the villagers who had passed away or moved on, each one placed in a spot that represented their former lives. A fisherman on the riverbank, a group of children in the schoolyard, an old man waiting at the bus stop. The photos online were haunting, but nothing could prepare me for the reality. The drive to Nagoro was long and winding, the road cutting through dense forests and climbing into the mountains. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the village in long, jagged shadows. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. The first doll I saw was a woman in a faded kimono, standing by the side of the road. Her face was smooth, her painted eyes gazing blankly into the trees. Her posture was unnervingly lifelike, as if she were waiting for someone. I slowed the car, my heart pounding. It was just a doll. I reminded myself, just fabric and paint. The village itself was smaller than I'd expected. A cluster of weathered wooden houses surrounded by fields gone wild. Dolls were everywhere. A man in a straw hat leaned against a fence, his plastic hands clutching a rake. A child with pigtails sat on a swing, her legs dangling stiffly. A group of women huddled near a shopfront, their heads bowed as if deep in conversation. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint creak of a broken windmill turning lazily in the breeze. I parked near the center of the village and stepped out, my camera slung over my shoulder. The air was colder than I'd expected, and I pulled my jacket tighter as I began to explore. First, it was fascinating. The level of detail in the dolls was incredible. from the wrinkles on their faces to the way their clothes seemed perfectly worn. I found myself snapping photo after photo, marveling at the eerie realism. But as the light faded, the atmosphere shifted. I was standing in what must have been the schoolyard, staring at a group of dolls posed as children playing tag. One of them, a boy in a red cap, seemed to be staring directly at me. His head was tilted slightly, his painted eyes wide and unblinking. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't just the cold. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sound came next, faint rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. I turned, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the rows of empty houses and the silent dolls. It's just the wind, I told myself, though the air was perfectly still. I decided to find Tsukimi Ayano. I'd read that she still lived in the village, and I wanted to ask her about her work. Her house wasn't hard to find. It was the only one with lights on, a warm glow spilling through the curtained windows. I knocked, and after a moment, the door creaked open. A tiny woman with a kind face and hands calloused from years of sewing stood before me. "You're here to see the dolls," she said, her voice soft but tinged with something I couldn't place. I nodded, suddenly unsure of myself. "They're incredible, but they feel so real." Her smile faltered. "They are real, in a way. They hold the spirit of this village." She invited me in for tea, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The walls were lined with more dolls, their blank faces catching the flickering light of the fire. I tried to focus on Tsukimi's words, but my eyes kept drifting to the figures around me. "Why do you make them?" I asked, clutching the warm cup in my hands. "To remember," she said simply. "To keep them here." The way she said it sent a chill through me, but I didn't press further. I thanked her for the tea and left, eager to be back in my car and away from the suffocating presence of the dolls. As I walked back through the village, the darkness closed in around me. The dolls seemed to shift in the shadows, their blank faces catching the moonlight in strange ways. The rustling sound returned, louder this time, accompanied by faint whispers, quickened my pace, my breath fogging in the cold air. My car was just ahead, its headlights a beacon in the dark. But as I reached for the door handle, I froze. There was a doll sitting in the driver's seat. It hadn't been there before. His face was pale, his painted eyes wide and staring. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers curled in an unnatural grip. I stumbled back, my mind racing. The whispers grew louder, the shadows around me deepening. I turned, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. Dolls stepping down from their perches, their stiff limbs creaking as they moved toward me. Panic took over. I bolted down the road, the sound of shuffling feet and faint laughter chasing me. The village blurred around me, the dolls' faces flashing in the corners of my vision. When I finally dared to look back, the village was dark and still. The dolls were where I'd left them, their painted faces blank and lifeless. But I knew what I'd seen. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn broke, I returned to the village, determined to retrieve my car and leave Nagoro behind. But when I arrived, the village was empty. Not a single doll remained. The schoolyard, the fields, the bus stop, they were all gone. Even Tsukimi's house was dark and abandoned, the windows boarded up as if no one had lived there in years. I never found my car. I hitchhiked back to the nearest town. My story met with blank stares and polite nods. No one seemed to know what I was talking about. I still see them sometimes, in the edges of my dreams. The dolls, their painted eyes wide and unblinking, their whispers calling me back to Nagoro. And I know, deep down, that if I return, I won't leave again. Story number 5. The Bride of the Afterlife. When I first arrived in the village of Lingtai, nestled in the misty hills of rural China, I was seeking a retreat from the noise and chaos of city life. As a freelance writer with a fascination for folklore, I thought the quiet, remote village would inspire stories of ancient traditions and rustic charm. I had no idea the story I'd uncover would be my own, and that it would end in terror. The villagers were kind but distant, their smiles polite but guarded. They didn't seem to know what to make of me, a foreigner staying in an old, crumbling guest house at the edge of the village. The only one who truly welcomed me was Mr. Chung, the elderly caretaker of the guest house. He had a warm smile, though his eyes carried a weight of sadness I couldn't place. "You've come at a special time," Chung said one evening as we sat by the fire. "The ghost festival approaches. It is when the veil between our world and the spirit world is at its thinnest." I leaned in, intrigued. "What happens during the festival?" Chung hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he sipped his tea. "Many things," he said, "but there's one tradition you must respect. If anyone offers you food, drink, or gifts at night, you must refuse." "Why?" I asked, half smiling. "Is it cursed?" Cheng's expression darkened. "Because it's not for you." The festival began the next night, and the village transformed. Lanterns swayed in the wind, casting an eerie glow over the cobblestone streets. Families placed offerings of food and paper money on small altars, the flames from burning incense curling into the air like ghostly fingers. There was an energy in the air, a strange mix of reverence and unease. That's when I met her. I was walking back to the guest house when I saw her standing by an ancient willow tree near the edge of the village. She was dressed in a traditional red qipao, her face pale and framed by jet-black hair. Her eyes caught mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. Not because she was frightening, but because her gaze felt hollow, as if it belonged to someone not entirely there. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice soft and melodic. "No," I replied, hesitant. "Just heading back to the guest house." She smiled faintly, tilting her head. "You shouldn't walk alone tonight. The spirits might follow." Something about her words, her tone, sent a chill through me. "Thanks for the warning," I said, stepping back. Before I could leave, she held out a small porcelain cup. "Drink," she said, "for safety." Cheng's warning echoed in my mind, but I didn't want to offend her. I accepted the cup, raising it to my lips but not drinking. Her eyes stayed locked on mine as I pretended to sip, and when I handed the cup back, her smile widened too wide. "You're kind," she whispered. "I think you'll make a wonderful husband." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond, and quickly made my way back to the guest house. I didn't look back, but I felt her gaze follow me all the way home. That night, I had the first dream. I was standing in a darkened room, the air thick with the scent of incense and decay. A table was set before me, laden with food, but the chairs around it were empty. And then I saw her, the woman in the red qipao, sitting at the far end of the table, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Do you accept me?" she asked, her voice echoing unnaturally. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. But the dreams didn't stop. Each night, they grew darker, more vivid. I saw flashes of her face, her hands reaching for mine, her laughter turning into a guttural scream. By the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I told Chung about the woman, about the cup, about the dreams. His face turned ashen. "You've been marked," he said gravely. "She is not of this world." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "She looked real. She spoke to me. She is a hunpa, a ghost bride," Chung explained. "Her family must have performed a spirit wedding for her. They've bound her to you." "A spirit wedding?" I asked, incredulous. Chung nodded. "In some villages, it is believed that the dead must not walk alone in the afterlife. If a family cannot find a living bride or groom for their deceased, they perform a wedding with the spirit world. The dead, they don't always stay where they belong." I felt a wave of nausea. "What happens if I'm bound to her?" Chung hesitated, his eyes filling with pity. "If the bond is not broken, she will take you with her." The following night, I stayed in the guest house, too terrified to leave. I bolted the doors and windows, lighting every candle I could find. But as midnight approached, the air grew heavy, the flickering flames dimming as a cold wind swept through the room. And then I heard it. A soft knock at the door. "Let me in." Her voice sang, melodic but tinged with something dark. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the talisman Chang had given me. "Go away," I shouted. The knock grew louder, more insistent. "You promised," she hissed. "You drank the cup. You're mine." The door shook violently, the wood splintering as shadows seeped through the cracks. Her voice grew louder, filling the room with a chilling chorus of whispers. "You're mine," she repeated, her face appearing in the window, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Come to me." I don't remember how long it lasted. When the dawn broke, the house was still, the shadows retreating with the first rays of sunlight. But I knew it wasn't over. She would return, and when she did, I wouldn't survive. Desperate, I turned to Chung. He agreed to help, though his face was pale with fear. "We must find her grave," he said. "Only then can we sever the bond." The search took us to the outskirts of the village, where an overgrown cemetery lay hidden among the trees. Chung led the way, his hands trembling as he held a lantern high. We found her grave at the edge of the burial ground, marked by a stone carved with her name, Mei Lin. Chung placed offerings by the grave, rice, incense, and joss paper, and began chanting an ancient prayer. The wind howled around us, and I felt the air grow colder, heavier, as if the ground itself was resisting. And then, she appeared. Mei Lin's form materialized from the shadows, her red qipao fluttering in the wind. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but her smile was wide, too wide. "You can't leave me," she whispered, her voice echoing through the cemetery. "We are bound." I clutched the talisman as Chung continued chanting, his voice rising above the wind. Mei Lin shrieked, her form flickering like a dying flame. She lunged toward me, her skeletal hands outstretched. But as the final words of the prayer echoed, she vanished. It's been 3 years since that night. I left Lingtai the next morning, vowing never to return. But some nights, when the wind howls and the shadows grow long, I hear her voice. "You're mine." And I wonder if the bond was ever truly broken. Story number 6. The Bell Witches Return. Tennessee is a place where history lingers. The air seems heavy with stories whispered through generations. Tales of battles fought, land claimed, and lives lost. But no story is as chilling or as enduring as that of the Bell Witch. I first heard about her when I was a kid. My grandmother used to tell me about the Bell family, how they were tormented by a spirit so malevolent it drove John Bell to his grave. I'd always thought of it as just a story, a piece of Southern folklore meant to scare children into behaving. But when I inherited a piece of land near Adams, Tennessee, the very ground where the Bell family once lived, I realized some stories never truly end. It started with the letter. The land had belonged to an uncle I barely knew, a reclusive man named Robert who had lived alone in a ramshackle farmhouse on the outskirts of Adams. When he passed, he left me the property with a simple note: "Take care of the land, but beware of what walks it." I dismissed it as the ramblings of a lonely old man. The house itself was in disrepair, the fields overgrown, but there was something oddly compelling about the place. I decided to spend a few weeks there, fixing it up and maybe finding a piece of myself in the process. The first few days were uneventful. The house was quiet, the only sounds the creak of the floorboards and the hum of insects outside. It wasn't until the 4th night that things began to change. I was lying in bed, the window open to let in the cool night air, when I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft I thought it might be the wind. But as I strained to listen, the sound grew clearer. Words, just out of reach, drifting through the darkness. I sat up, my heart pounding. The whispers stopped, replaced by the creak of footsteps on the porch. "Who's there?" I called, grabbing the flashlight from my bedside table. The light cut through the night, illuminating nothing but the empty porch. But the air felt heavy, charged, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I closed the window and locked it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere: the attic, the cellar, the empty hallways. At night, I would hear scratching at the walls, faint laughter echoing through the house. And then, things started to move. It began with small objects, keys disappearing, books falling off shelves. But soon, it escalated. Chairs would slide across the room on their own. Doors slammed shut without warning. One night, I woke to find the kitchen table flipped over, the chairs stacked precariously on top of it. It was as if the house itself was alive, and it didn't want me there. I called a local historian, a woman named Clara who specialized in the Bell Witch legend. She was reluctant to talk at first, but when I mentioned the land, her tone shifted. "That land is cursed," she said flatly. "It's where the Bell Witch was strongest. You should leave." "I just want to know what's happening," I insisted. "What does it want?" Clara sighed. The Bell Witch was never just a ghost. She was something else, something darker. She fed on fear, on chaos. And if she's back... She didn't finish the sentence, but the warning was clear. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the house. I set up a camera in the living room and stayed up, waiting. The house was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply, and I saw my breath fog in the air. And then, she spoke. The voice was low and raspy, layered with something inhuman. "You shouldn't be here." The room seemed to vibrate with the sound, the shadows in the corners growing darker, deeper. The camera fell to the floor, its light blinking out, as a shape began to form in the darkness. At first, it was just a shadow, indistinct and shifting, but then it stepped forward, and I saw her, a figure cloaked in black, her face pale and hollow, her eyes burning with an unnatural light. "Leave," she hissed, her voice echoing through the room. "Or stay and suffer." I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and menacing. For a moment, I considered leaving for good, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the stubborn belief that I could end this. I went back inside. The next few days were a blur of fear and exhaustion. The whispers never stopped, and the presence in the house grew stronger, more oppressive. I started finding messages scrawled on the walls in soot. "Get out. This is my land. You can't win." One night, I woke to find her standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes glowing in the darkness. She didn't speak this time, but the air around her seemed to hum with malevolence. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as she reached out a skeletal hand toward me. When I finally found the strength to scream, she vanished, leaving only the sound of her laughter. I called Clara again, desperate for help. "How do I stop this?" pleaded. "You can't," she said. "The Bell Witch isn't something you can fight. You can only leave." "But why me?" I asked. "What does she want?" "She wants what she's always wanted," Clara replied. "To remind the world that she's still here." I left the next morning. The house stood silent as I drove away, its dark windows watching me go. But as I reached the edge of the property, I saw her again, standing in the field. Her shadow stretched impossibly long in the early morning light, and her eyes followed me until I was out of sight. I sold the land to a developer, though part of me knew it wouldn't matter. The Bell Witch doesn't care about ownership papers or deeds. She cares about the land, the story, the fear. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Sometimes I see shadows moving in the corners of my apartment. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear her voice, low and mocking. "You can't win." And I believe her. Story number 7. Hinterkaifeck, the farmhouse whispers. Horror has a way of lingering. It doesn't just stay in the stories or the ruins of a place. It seeps into the soil, into the very air. That's what I felt when I first heard about Hinterkaifeck. It was late October, 2019. I was living in Munich, teaching English, and spending most of my free time exploring Bavaria's countryside. That's how I stumbled across the legend of Hinterkaifeck, a farmhouse where an entire family was brutally murdered nearly a century ago. The case had never been solved, and the mystery around it had only grown darker with time. Locals wouldn't speak of it openly. When I asked, they would glance away, muttering about curses and evil spirits. But the more they avoided it, the more I felt drawn to it. By December, I'd made up my mind. I was going to visit the site. The farmhouse was long gone, burned down decades ago, but the land remained, a lonely clearing surrounded by dense woods, miles from the nearest village. I packed my car with a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and a copy of the case file I'd found online. It was a snowy afternoon when I arrived, the kind of cold that bites through even the thickest coat. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just the absence of human activity, but the oppressive kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. Even the wind seemed muted as I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The clearing was barren, save for the foundation stones of the old farmhouse, half buried in the snow. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ruins. Felt wrong, as though the ground itself was watching me. I shook off the unease and started exploring. The case file had described the events leading up to the murders in chilling detail. The Gruber family, Andreas, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, her 2 children, and the family maid, had all been found bludgeoned to death in the barn and house. But it was the days before the massacre that haunted me most. Andreas had reported hearing footsteps in the attic, finding footprints in the snow leading to the house but none leaving, and noticing strange disturbances around the property. Yet he never told anyone beyond a few neighbors. As I walked the site, I tried to imagine what it must have been like to live here, isolated and vulnerable. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, and I shivered. It wasn't just the cold. That night, I stayed in a nearby inn. The proprietor, an older woman with kind eyes, raised an eyebrow when I mentioned Hinterkaifeck. "Why would you go there?" she asked, her voice low. "I'm curious," I replied. "It's fascinating, isn't it? The mystery." She hesitated, then leaned closer. "Some mysteries are better left alone." Her words lingered with me as I lay in bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. The wind howled outside, and somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard footsteps crunching through the snow. I returned to the site the next day, determined to dig deeper. The snow had fallen heavier overnight, blanketing the clearing in pristine white. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They led from the edge of the woods to the center of the clearing, where the barn had once stood. My breath fogged in the cold air as I followed them, my heart pounding. The prints were large, too large to be human, and they stopped abruptly at the ruins. There were no prints leading away. The unease from the day before returned. Stronger this time, I pulled out my flashlight, despite the daylight, and began inspecting the ruins. The foundation stones were cracked and covered in moss, but something glinted beneath the snow. Kneeling, I brushed it away and uncovered a rusted axe. My stomach turned. The axe matched the description of the murder weapon. I stared at it, my hands trembling. That's when I heard it, the faintest whisper, carried on the wind. It was too soft to make out, but it sent a chill down my spine. I turned to leave, but the ground beneath me shifted. It was as if the earth itself was trying to pull me back, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was a cacophony of voices. "Get out," they seemed to say. "Leave." I ran back to my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The clearing seemed darker now, the trees closing in like a cage. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows, but its presence was undeniable. It didn't move, didn't chase me. It just watched as I sped down the narrow road, the trees whipping past in a blur. That night, back at the inn, couldn't sleep. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind, set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard it again, footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway outside my room. I held my breath, the axe from the ruins still vivid in my mind. The footsteps stopped at my door, and then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. I didn't move, didn't breathe. As the handle turned ever so slightly, the lock held, but the door creaked as though under pressure. After what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated, fading into silence. I left the inn at dawn, refusing to look back. As I drove away, I noticed something in the rearview mirror, footprints in the snow, leading from the inn to the woods, and just before the treeline, a shadow. I never returned to Hinterkaifeck. Whatever happened to the Gruber family, whatever evil lingered there, it wasn't finished. Some say the past can't hurt you, that history is just stories and facts. But I know better now. Some places remember, and some places want you to stay.